2 a.m., the silence of my home was shattered by the sound of my phone vibrating on the kitchen counter. I froze, my hands shaking as I stared at the screen. The caller ID read, Liam, mobile. My heart stopped. Liam, my beloved son, had been gone for 4 years. The air in the room felt colder than usual, and the shadows stretching across the walls seemed to lean closer, as if they were waiting for my reaction. I could not move. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible, yet there it was. His name on the display, blinking insistently, demanding I answer. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe exhaustion, maybe grief from years ago finally catching up. But the voice on the line was unmistakable. Gentle, pleading, and yet terrifyingly real. Mom, let me in. It's freezing out here, it said. My body trembled. My breath caught in my chest. I wanted to run, to hide, but the sound of his voice rooted me to the spot. Was I losing my mind? Or was someone trying to make me believe I was? The memory of his last day on Earth rushed back, uninvited. I could still feel the emptiness when the accident was reported. My arms ached for him. My heart ached for the future that would never be. And now, here he was again, or something pretending to be him, at the most impossible hour. Fear wrapped around me like a vice, and yet curiosity pricked at the edges of my terror. I had to know who, or what, was behind this. This was no ordinary call. Something about it felt deliberate, targeted, not random. I thought of my children, Beatrix and Theo. Their visits had become infrequent, their smiles strained, their words often edged with impatience or thinly veiled contempt. Money, inheritance, control. They had begun to measure love in pounds and cents, as if a mother's care could be weighed and compared. Could they be involved in this nightmare? I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. Every instinct in my body screamed danger, yet the voice, the pleading in Liam's tone, made me question reality itself. Was this truly Liam? Or was it a trap designed to make me falter, to shake my confidence, to see me crumble? I felt vulnerable, exposed, alone, yet I also felt a spark of determination. No one would manipulate me without consequence, not even my own children. Have you ever felt gaslit by someone you trusted? Have you ever doubted your own memory because someone else wanted you to? This is the moment when fear becomes clarity, when doubt forces you to confront truths you would rather ignore. At that instant, I realized that my world had shifted. The home I once knew, filled with memories and warmth, now felt like a battleground. Every creak in the floor, every flicker of light, every shadow seemed charged with intent. I was no longer simply a mother mourning her son. I was a target, and I had to act carefully, or the cost would be far greater than fear. As I took a step toward the door, my thoughts raced. What if this call was the first move in a larger game? A game I hadn't consented to play, orchestrated by those I loved most, or by someone who wanted me to falter. The voice had tapped into my deepest grief, my most vulnerable instincts. And yet, despite the terror, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not be fooled. I would not give up control. My mind might shake, my body might tremble, but my resolve would remain intact. What you are about to hear is the story of that night. The call, the fear, the revelation, and the choices I made in the shadows of grief and deceit. It is a story of trust broken, of manipulation, and of the lengths some will go to claim what they believe is theirs. But it is also a story of courage, clarity, and the power of seeing through lies to uncover the truth. If you think this could never happen to you or your family, think again. What happens to elders like me could happen anywhere, to anyone you love. Don't let it. Subscribe now to be aware, because the line between love and greed can be thinner than you imagine. My name is Edith, and I have lived 74 years in this small town of Cedar Hollow. My home has walls lined with books I've collected over decades, shelves that once overflowed with photographs of birthdays, holidays, and moments that now feel like echoes of another life. I am a widow. My husband, Arthur, passed away quietly in his sleep many years ago. He was a careful man, a planner, a lover of surprises. He never imagined that the one thing he tried to protect, his family, would become a source of deception and betrayal after he was gone. I live alone now, with only my memories and the occasional visits from neighbors who have grown fond of my stories. I often sit by the window, staring at the street lined with trees whose leaves turn gold in the fall, and wonder how life became so complicated. I was always careful, always loving, always trying to hold my family together. And yet, love does not always prevent the unexpected. My children, Beatrix and Theo, have grown into adults I barely recognize. Beatrix, sharp and ambitious, has always had a calculating mind, measuring relationships by what they could yield. Theo, charming on the surface, has always had a need for control that makes him difficult to reason with. And then there was Liam, the one child who carried a light in his heart, a sensitivity that made him impossible to ignore, impossible not to love. Losing him changed everything. Even before that fateful night, I began to notice small changes in the dynamics with my remaining children. Visits became less frequent. Conversations turned to money and responsibility rather than warmth and care. Beatrix would make remarks about how I must be careful with finances. Theo would offer advice that felt more like commands than suggestions. I felt the subtle shift in their eyes, the way they looked at me with impatience, or worse, calculation. My intuition whispered warnings, but I ignored them, hoping my fears were unfounded, hoping love could still anchor us to the family I once knew. Despite my careful nature, I could feel the isolation creeping in. There were moments when I would prepare a meal, expecting a knock at the door, only to hear silence. I could sit in the living room with the clock ticking, the wind rattling the panes, and realize that once constant visits had turned into empty spaces. I thought about the years I had spent nurturing them, teaching them kindness, and yet now it seemed my presence had become inconvenient. The truth settled like a heavy weight. My children were measuring me not by the mother I had been, but by what I could give, what I could provide, what I represented in terms of inheritance and control. I often ask myself whether this is the experience of many older people. The slow realization that those you love may one day prioritize self-interest over care, that warmth can be overshadowed by greed. Have you ever felt the sting of being overlooked, dismissed, or questioned simply because of age? There is a particular pain in knowing that the ones who once relied on your guidance may now view you as a hindrance, someone to manage, someone to manipulate. It is a quiet cruelty, often unspoken, but deeply felt. There are days when I wander through the rooms of my home, my fingers trailing along surfaces, recalling laughter that once filled these spaces. I remember Liam's laughter in the kitchen, Theo's boastful chatter in the living room, Beatrix quietly reading in a corner, taking in everything and calculating. And then the silence hits. I am left alone with memories that both comfort and ache. I reflect on the lessons life has given me, the importance of resilience, the necessity of self-awareness, the realization that love alone cannot always protect you from betrayal. Even amidst the sorrow, I recognize the strength that resides in experience. My years have taught me patience and discernment. I have learned to observe, to read intentions beyond words, to recognize when a smile masks motives I cannot yet name. And now, more than ever, I must rely on that experience, because the events of that night, the call, the fear, the realization of deceit, demand more than grief. They demand clarity, strategy, and resolve. As I look back on the life I have led, I also recognize the mistakes I have made, the moments I allowed hope to blind me to reality, the times I trusted too easily. Yet, these experiences have also prepared me for the choices I must make now. I am no longer simply a mother mourning her son. I am a woman who has faced loss, who has faced betrayal, who now stands ready to confront what was hidden in plain sight for too long. The tension between love and caution, between fear and action, has become my constant companion. I have learned that self-preservation is not selfishness, and that knowing when to act is as important as knowing whom to trust. In the quiet of Cedar Hollow, with the night pressing close and the weight of the past pressing harder, I have found a new resolve. One that will guide me through the coming trials, the revelations, and the moments when the true nature of those around me is laid bare. This is the story of my life, the story of my family, and the story of the night that changed everything. It is a story of love tested, of deception revealed, and of courage reclaimed. It is a story I must tell, not only for myself but for anyone who has ever faced doubt, fear, or betrayal from those they trusted most. Because knowing the truth, facing it, and acting on it can make the difference between despair and justice. Liam was the child who carried a quiet light, the one who understood my moods without explanation, the one whose laughter could fill a room even on the darkest days. Losing him changed the rhythm of my life entirely. The day of the accident is etched in my mind with painful clarity. I remember the call from the hospital, the shock that stopped my heart, and the way the world seemed to tilt beneath me. There was no preparation, no warning, just a sudden emptiness that no words could describe. In the hours and days that followed, grief was not something I could contain. It weighed on me physically, a constant ache in my chest and a hollow feeling in my stomach. I wandered the halls of my home, touching his belongings, his small desk tucked in the corner, his favorite books neatly stacked. The silence was deafening, filled with the echoes of his voice, now gone. I would sit in his room, staring at the empty chair, imagining his presence, wondering if I would ever feel the warmth of his hand in mine again. My grief was compounded by the subtle shifts in my other children. Beatrix and Theo became more distant, more irritable, less concerned with the comfort I needed and more focused on practical matters, money, possessions, and inheritance. Conversations that once revolved around memories or shared jokes were replaced with financial discussions and comments about my age. I noticed the way their eyes sometimes lingered on my savings, the estate, and the items they thought would benefit them. It was a small, quiet betrayal that grew heavier with each passing day. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining a life where Liam was still here. I remembered his gentle voice calling me from the kitchen, asking about my day, or the way he would bring me flowers he had picked from the garden. Those memories brought both comfort and unbearable pain. I knew in my heart that he had been taken too soon, and yet I could not let go of the longing to hear him again, to feel him near. The tension between Beatrix and Theo intensified in the aftermath of Liam's death. Where once they might have grieved together, they now competed silently, subtly, for what they believed they were entitled to. Their interactions with me became less about support and more about assertion. Each visit, each phone call, seemed to carry an undercurrent of calculation. I began to sense that grief was being overshadowed by self-interest, that my pain was becoming an opportunity for them to advance their own ambitions. Even in my sadness, I noticed the small signs, the way Beatrix would frown at my spending, the way Theo questioned every decision I made, the careful attention they paid to documents and letters. I wondered if they saw my mourning as weakness, a vulnerability to exploit. And yet, I could not bring myself to confront them directly. The grief was still raw, the loss still too heavy. I had to navigate this new reality with care, balancing sorrow with observation, mourning with awareness. I often recall one evening in particular, shortly after Liam's passing. I sat in his empty room, holding a sweater he had left behind, and felt the full weight of what had changed. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind outside and the soft ticking of the clock. In that quiet, I realized that grief was only the beginning. There were truths I had not yet uncovered, tensions I had not yet fully understood, and a vulnerability in my household that I had to face with vigilance. My children's focus had shifted, and in that shift, I saw the first threads of the conflict that would later engulf us all. Liam's absence also revealed the fragility of the bonds I thought unbreakable. The family I had nurtured, the household I had maintained, began to show cracks in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. It became clear that the love and care I had poured into raising my children could be overshadowed by ambition and greed. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that parental love alone does not guarantee loyalty, and that even the strongest bonds can be tested by loss and opportunity. Yet, even amid the sorrow and tension, a seed of clarity began to grow within me. I understood that mourning would not be enough. I had to watch, to listen, to learn the true nature of those around me. Liam's death was devastating, but it also forced me to see what had been hidden. The calculation, the impatience, and the quiet contest over inheritance that was already shaping itself in the corners of our family life. This realization, though painful, would become my guide. I could honor my son's memory not only by remembering him but by confronting the realities left behind, with careful observation and unwavering resolve. Through the grief, I began to prepare for the moments to come, aware that loss had exposed vulnerabilities I could no longer ignore. I resolved to protect myself and the memory of Liam, to navigate the delicate balance between mourning and vigilance, and to discover the truths that lay buried under polite smiles and hidden intentions. The tragedy of losing him was only the beginning, and I knew that the conflicts it ignited would demand courage, strategy, and unwavering clarity. The first real indication that my family was no longer guided by love and care came not with harsh words, but with documents. Liam's investments had been private, carefully managed, and mostly unknown to me. I trusted him to keep his affairs orderly, and for a while, I felt comforted knowing that he had planned for the future. That future, however, became a source of tension I had never anticipated. It began subtly. Beatrix came over one afternoon under the pretense of helping me sort through old papers. Her tone was calm, almost pleasant, but there was an edge to her questions. She asked about Liam's accounts, the assets he had inherited from Arthur, and the instructions he had left regarding his estate. Theo joined in, casually observing, making comments about what I should do with certain investments and whether I had updated my will. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that they were simply concerned for me. But the way they lingered on details, the questions that went beyond ordinary interest, stirred unease in my heart. I began to notice patterns. Beatrix would mention, in passing, that it was important to review documents carefully, that mistakes could be costly, that planning for old age required vigilance. Theo would echo her points, often adding that I might not fully understand the financial complexities. Their words, meant to appear helpful, carried a subtle weight, a hint that they did not entirely trust my judgment. I realized they were testing me, watching for any hesitation, any uncertainty. One day, while organizing Liam's papers, I discovered a copy of his updated will. It was neatly folded, tucked into a file labeled Family Trust. My hands shook as I unfolded it. I read the lines, each one hitting me like a cold wave. Liam had made provisions not only for me, as his mother, but also for his siblings. Yet there was something unusual, something that hinted at foresight and perhaps a precaution against those who might seek to claim what was not rightfully theirs. I felt a chill, recognizing that his careful planning might be more than a simple legal measure. It might be a shield against greed. I observed my children closely, and I could see the moment their eyes fell on certain names, certain numbers. Beatrix's brow tightened. Theo's fingers drummed against the table. Their reactions, though subtle, were revealing. They were not simply curious. They were calculating, assessing, and perhaps planning. It was in that instant I understood the danger. My children, whom I had loved and raised, were beginning to see me not as a parent, but as an obstacle. My presence, my decisions, and my control over our affairs were suddenly a threat to their ambitions. The tension grew in daily interactions. Casual conversations were punctuated with comments about the estate, questions about timing, and subtle reminders of my age. They would compliment me one moment, question my judgment the next. It became clear that the inheritance, once a distant thought, had become the focal point of their attention. My role as mother and guide was being overshadowed by financial concerns, and the subtle shift in their priorities filled me with a mixture of fear and resolve. I began to consider the implications carefully. What would I do if those I trusted most were plotting not only to challenge me but also to manipulate circumstances in their favor? The answer was simple. I had to be vigilant. I could no longer assume that love or familiarity would protect me. The documents I had once considered ordinary now took on a new significance. Each line, each clause, each signature became a puzzle piece in a game I had not realized I was playing. A game of patience, strategy, and observation. During this period, I noticed that even our interactions with neighbors and friends were subtly influenced by the children. Beatrix would casually mention community matters that involved finances. Theo would note how certain assets could grow in value if managed correctly. It was as if they were rehearsing arguments, positioning themselves to appear rational while testing boundaries. I felt the growing tension like a weight pressing on my chest. I could sense that a storm was forming, not of nature, but of intention. And I realized that when the time came, I would need clarity, courage, and careful planning to face what was coming. The inheritance conflict was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing tension within my home. I watched my children, measured their reactions, and began preparing myself mentally for the confrontation that seemed inevitable. The love that had once bound us was now entangled with ambition and desire. Their eyes, once filled with childhood warmth, now carried calculation, and every smile seemed edged with intent. In those moments, I understood that survival, even emotional survival, required vigilance. I also reflected on Liam and his foresight. Perhaps he had sensed the dynamics that could emerge, the human tendencies that could compromise family bonds. Perhaps he had written provisions not only to protect assets but to ensure that the truth of loyalty and care would guide inheritance. His intentions were now a secret shield I had yet to fully uncover, and it became my task to respect his foresight while navigating the dangerous currents forming around me. Every day that passed, I grew more certain that the ordinary warmth of family life had been replaced by careful scrutiny and silent competition. I knew that the challenge was not merely financial. It was moral, emotional, and deeply personal. My children had begun to see me as an opponent, and I had no choice but to respond with equal awareness and careful strategy. The moment of confrontation, I sensed, was approaching, and I would need every ounce of resolve to face it. This was the turning point. The inheritance conflict was no longer abstract. It had entered the realm of reality. My children's intentions were becoming clear, and the time for observation had passed. It was now a test of clarity, courage, and understanding. I understood that I could not rely solely on love to guide the outcome. I had to think, to act, and to prepare for what they were willing to risk to achieve their goals. After the tension over the inheritance began to take shape, I noticed another, more subtle form of pressure: isolation. Visits from Beatrix and Theo became less frequent, and when they did appear, their presence was no longer warm. Their smiles were careful, measured, as if each expression was weighed against what they could gain from my response. I realized that their attention was no longer about family or concern. It was a test of my resilience, a probe into my willingness to bend to their desires. Even ordinary interactions became opportunities for subtle manipulation. I would suggest spending time together, perhaps for a meal or a walk through the neighborhood, only to be met with excuses. Beatrix would say she had work, appointments, or commitments elsewhere. Theo would shrug, saying he had errands and could only stop by briefly. I began to feel the gradual shrinking of my world, the careful way they were limiting my companionship and the warmth I once took for granted. During phone calls, they would couch questions in concern but edge them with implication. "Are you sure you remembered to review your finances?" Beatrix asked one evening, her tone casual yet pointed. "At our age, mistakes can be costly," Theo added, a soft laugh masking an unmistakable pressure. Every conversation seemed to revolve around my age, my decisions, my supposed inability to manage affairs. The intention behind these words became clear. They were slowly shaping me into someone dependent, uncertain, questioning my own judgment. I became aware that they were testing boundaries, exploring how far they could push without confrontation. When I hesitated on a suggestion or paused before answering, I noticed the brief flash of expectation in their eyes, the subtle tightening of their lips. They were measuring me, assessing my reactions, looking for weakness or compliance. At first, I felt despair, as though the people I trusted most were quietly eroding my independence. But gradually, clarity replaced fear. I understood that this was no ordinary family tension. This was a deliberate attempt to soften my resolve, to create doubt, and to position themselves for a greater advantage. Even in everyday routines, I began to feel the quiet pressure. A casual visit to the grocery store or a walk around the neighborhood became occasions for them to remind me of responsibilities I could not fully grasp or decisions that might be better left to them. Each comment, seemingly innocuous, carried the weight of judgment. I felt the slow accumulation of their control, the gentle nudges designed to weaken my confidence. It was a form of emotional erosion, almost imperceptible if one were not attentive. I could sense that Beatrix and Theo's behavior was calculated, aimed at testing how much I would tolerate before reacting. It was in their body language, the way they leaned slightly forward in conversation, the subtle narrowing of eyes, the occasional pause before speaking. Every word, every gesture, seemed designed to weigh my reactions, to see if fear or compliance could be coaxed from me. At first, I doubted myself, wondering if I was imagining the tension, questioning whether my mind was exaggerating the signs. But repeated patterns made the truth undeniable. I was being isolated, observed, and maneuvered. The experience was emotionally exhausting. There were nights when I would sit alone in my living room, staring at the muted glow of the lamp, feeling the weight of solitude. Even simple tasks, like preparing a meal or tidying the kitchen, carried a sense of emptiness, as if the absence of true companionship underscored the deliberate isolation. I felt the quiet erosion of my confidence and independence. Yet, alongside the fear, there was a growing resolve. I began to see the purpose behind their actions, to understand that this psychological pressure was not random, it was a strategy. I reflected on the nature of family relationships, realizing how quickly trust and warmth could be leveraged against those who care most. My grief over Liam's death, the earlier tension over inheritance, and now the isolation orchestrated by my own children painted a complex picture. Love and loyalty were being tested in ways that left no room for error. I understood that survival in this environment required vigilance, awareness, and the ability to recognize manipulation before it became overwhelming. With each interaction, I grew more alert, noting patterns, observing nuances, and measuring intentions. I began to prepare, not in anger, but in quiet calculation. Every comment, every delay, every subtle insinuation was being catalogued, stored for later consideration. I realized that emotional resilience alone was insufficient. I needed clarity, strategy, and a plan to counter the pressures being placed upon me. Isolation, I learned, was a tool, and those who wielded it carefully, subtly, and persistently could shape the thoughts and actions of even the most aware. But I refused to yield. I began to understand the contours of their intentions, the edges of their ambitions, and the faint outlines of the schemes they might pursue. While they thought they were molding me into compliance, I was quietly observing, preparing for the moment when I could reclaim control. Even in solitude, I found strength. I recognized that awareness could counter manipulation, that attentiveness could reveal strategy, and that patience could outlast coercion. In the quiet hours of Cedar Hollow, I began to gather my resolve, understanding that isolation was only one step in a larger sequence, one that I intended to navigate and, eventually, overturn. I had always trusted Arthur's foresight, his careful planning, and his unwavering thoughtfulness. He had been a man who anticipated not just the ordinary challenges of life, but the hidden trials that might come from those closest to us. When I discovered the details of Liam's will and the family trust, I also came across something that made my heart both tremble and steady at the same time. A clause, quietly inserted, almost like a secret shield, that no one except Arthur and Liam had discussed openly. Arthur had written it with precision, foreseeing the very greed and ambition that now threatened to undermine our family. It was a provision in the trust that required more than mere inheritance eligibility. It demanded care, respect, and genuine support for me in my later years. Only those who demonstrated true devotion and attentiveness, who proved their love through actions, not just words, could receive their portion. Arthur had anticipated that ambition alone could corrupt, that entitlement could blind judgment, and that selfishness could take advantage of vulnerability. This clause, though hidden, was designed to protect me, and through me, Liam's memory. When I first read it, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because it meant that Liam and Arthur had thought ahead, ensuring that the legacy they left was safeguarded against manipulation. Dread, because I immediately understood that Beatrix and Theo would not take it lightly. I could see their expressions the next time documents were discussed. Beatrix's sharp gaze, Theo's subtle tightening of the jaw. They were aware that some condition existed that could jeopardize their plans. And I realized in that moment that this hidden clause was not just a legal safeguard. It was a catalyst for the very confrontation that now loomed over my home. The clause was simple in words but complex in implication. It required a consistent, demonstrable commitment to my well-being. It did not allow for pretense or occasional gestures of affection. It required daily attention, genuine concern, and the kind of loyalty that could not be feigned. Beatrix and Theo, I knew, would soon attempt to navigate this obstacle, and I anticipated the lengths they might go to circumvent the conditions, to prove themselves falsely, or to manipulate circumstances in their favor. Their awareness of its existence was a spark that would ignite their next moves. I began to observe them more closely, noting their reactions, their subtle attempts to gauge my health, their probing questions about investments and responsibilities. Every interaction now carried a hidden weight, as if they were testing the boundaries of the clause without realizing that I, too, had become aware. I realized that the clause was not just a legal device. It was a shield and a warning, a measure of character and integrity. Those who could not meet its conditions would reveal themselves through actions. And the more I watched, the more I understood that Beatrix and Theo were already under scrutiny, their intentions gradually exposed through their own behavior. This discovery also brought clarity to my own role. The clause meant that I was not merely a passive participant in the unfolding drama. I was an active guardian of Liam's memory, an observer of character, and a judge of intentions. The responsibility weighed heavily on me, but it also imbued me with a sense of purpose. I could no longer allow myself to be swayed by appearances, smiles, or seemingly caring gestures. Every act, every word, every visit had to be measured, observed, and understood in the context of loyalty, devotion, and genuine concern. The knowledge of the clause gave me a quiet confidence. I understood that the path ahead required patience and careful observation. I could watch, record, and allow the true nature of my children to reveal itself. The clause was Arthur's gift of protection, a safeguard embedded in the trust that ensured only those deserving would benefit. And I realized that it was now my task to honor that gift, to remain vigilant, and to prepare for the moment when the hidden intentions of Beatrix and Theo would be made clear. At the same time, a subtle tension filled the household. I noticed the way Beatrix would linger near documents, her fingers tracing lines as if memorizing them, her mind racing through possibilities. Theo would observe interactions between us, noting reactions, timing responses, weighing actions against expectations. The clause had shifted the dynamic entirely. What had begun as a battle over finances and inheritance was now a test of integrity, loyalty, and devotion. A test that would expose ambition and duplicity with stark clarity. The hidden clause also became a personal measure of my own strength. It reminded me that I was not helpless, that I was capable of discernment, and that the wisdom accumulated through decades of life could guide me in evaluating the intentions of others. While fear and doubt lingered, they were tempered by the awareness that the law, carefully designed and intentionally written, was now aligned with my understanding of the household's true nature. I was no longer entirely vulnerable. I was equipped with knowledge, vigilance, and an opportunity to act when the time was right. Arthur's foresight had given me a weapon in a battle I had not asked for but could not avoid. The hidden clause was more than words on paper. It was a measure of truth, a beacon in the fog of uncertainty, and a tool to reveal the hearts of those who claimed to love me. With it in mind, I prepared to observe, to wait, and to respond. For the first time since Liam's passing, I felt the quiet assurance that the unfolding events, however tense or challenging, were guided not by chance, but by intention, and that I was now an active participant in safeguarding the legacy of those I loved most. The betrayal did not arrive with a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in papers that seemed harmless and words that sounded ordinary. Beatrix and Theo invited me to a family financial review, a meeting that, on the surface, appeared practical and responsible. They framed it as a way to ensure I understood every detail, every document, every decision. I trusted them, as I had so many times before. I did not yet realize that trust was the very thing they intended to exploit. As I sat at the polished dining table, the morning sunlight spilling over stacks of papers, I felt a tension I could not fully name. Beatrix handed me forms with the casual comment, "It's just routine, Mother. Nothing to worry about." Theo chimed in with a reassuring smile, We want to make sure everything is in order for your protection." I nodded, trusting, and began to sign the papers. The documents were long, complex, and legal in tone, and I believed them to be standard procedures, part of the ongoing financial oversight they had insisted was necessary. It was only later, when I took the time to examine the paperwork carefully, that I realized the gravity of what had occurred. I had signed away not just authority over certain decisions, but control over my own future. The trust, the estate, even aspects of my personal autonomy had been subtly redirected. Beatrix and Theo had twisted language, disguised intent, and presented the forms as routine oversight, knowing that my trust in them would prevent careful scrutiny. They had effectively removed me from the decision-making process while maintaining the illusion of involvement. Anger and disbelief surged through me, sharp and sudden. How could the children I had raised, nurtured, and loved commit such acts? I felt the weight of betrayal like a heavy stone pressing down, and yet beneath the anger, a clarity began to emerge. The patterns I had noticed, the subtle manipulation, the probing questions, the careful observation, now made sense. They had been planning this for months, quietly positioning themselves to seize control, while ensuring I would remain unaware until it was too late. I remembered Liam and Arthur. Their foresight, their care, their understanding of human nature. It became painfully clear why the hidden clause existed. Without it, Beatrix and Theo's actions might have gone entirely unchecked. The clause was not merely a legal safeguard. It was a measure of truth, a compass to reveal intentions that could not be hidden behind polite words or charming smiles. And yet, even with this knowledge, I realized I had been drawn into their plan more than I had imagined, signing papers that I believed were benign, unaware that I had stepped directly into their trap. The realization forced me to confront a painful truth. Love and trust are not always returned with honor. I had given both freely, assuming that the bonds of family were unbreakable. And yet, Beatrix and Theo had transformed those bonds into tools for manipulation, using my affection and confidence as leverage to achieve their ambitions. The anger was bitter, but beneath it was a growing determination. I could no longer rely on passive observation or gentle reasoning. The time for careful planning and strategic action had arrived. I began to recall the small signs I had ignored, the subtle tests, the probing questions, the casual reminders about finances and responsibility. Each of these moments, once dismissed as ordinary concern, now revealed itself as part of a larger design, a deliberate effort to weaken my confidence and position themselves advantageously. Their smiles, their patience, their outward calm, each had been a carefully constructed mask, concealing intent and ambition. The confrontation was unavoidable. When I finally addressed the signed documents with Beatrix and Theo, the tension erupted into words that revealed the depth of their disregard for me. "We know what Dad wanted," Theo said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. Beatrix added, "Everything has to be in order. We're just making sure it's done right." Their words carried no warmth, no care, only assertion, only an insistence on control. I could feel my resolve hardening, a spark of clarity amidst the storm of betrayal. In that moment, rage and strategy merged. I realized that their deception had not gone unnoticed, that every subtle move they had made had been recorded in my memory, catalogued for future reckoning. Their confidence, their sense of superiority, their belief that they could manipulate me without consequence, it was a mistake. I had observed, I had listened, and now, I understood the full scope of their intentions. I resolved to reclaim control, not through confrontation alone, but through preparation, foresight, and careful strategy. I would wait for the right moment, use their overconfidence against them, and reveal the truth in a way that could not be denied. The betrayal had revealed their character, and character, I knew, always left traces. Small, observable, undeniable traces that patience and attention could uncover. The household, once filled with casual warmth, had become a stage for testing loyalties and exposing ambitions. I had been a participant in their performance, signing papers under the illusion of trust, and yet I had also been an observer. The betrayal was complete, the intentions exposed, and the game had shifted. I was no longer merely a mother or a grandmother. I was a strategist, quietly preparing to turn deception into revelation, to transform fear into justice, and to ensure that the truth would prevail. And in that moment of clarity, I understood that the next phase was inevitable. The subtle acts of manipulation, the casual threats hidden in smiles, the careful positioning, they were all signs that the confrontation was drawing near. I had been patient, I had been vigilant, and now I was ready. The betrayal had been made official, and it had also revealed the path forward. I would not be deceived again, and I would ensure that the truth and Liam's memory would guide the outcome. It was just past 2 in the morning when the phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The sound startled me, pulling me from a light sleep. I glanced at the screen, and my heart stopped. The caller ID read, Liam, mobile. My hands froze on the edge of the counter, trembling so violently that the glass of water I had left nearby nearly toppled. Liam had passed away 4 years ago. For long years without the warmth of his voice, without the comfort of his presence, without the laughter that had filled my home. I stared at the screen, a cold shiver running down my spine. The hallway behind me seemed darker than usual, shadows stretching and twisting across the walls. Every instinct screamed at me to drop the phone and retreat, but something compelled me to answer. My mind raced with impossible explanations. Was this a prank? A cruel twist of fate? Had I imagined the vibrations, the name, the familiar tones? Or was someone deliberately trying to break me, to make me doubt my sanity? The moment I lifted the receiver, a voice spoke, soft, hesitant, unmistakably Liam's. Mom, let me in. It's cold out here. My knees buckled beneath me. I gripped the counter, trying to steady myself. I could feel the room chill, the hairs on my arms rising as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. Every memory of Liam, every detail of his face, his tone, and the way he had always spoken, surged through me. My heart pounded with fear, confusion, and a desperate longing to believe. I moved toward the door, each step a mixture of trepidation and disbelief. Outside, the night was still, the air heavy and cold, the kind of darkness that felt as though it could reach into your chest and freeze your courage. When I peered through the peephole, I froze. There he was, or what looked exactly like him, standing under the faint glow of the porch light. My breath caught in my throat. The shape, the posture, even the expression on his face mirrored every detail I remembered from the past. I could not comprehend it. My trembling hands hovered over the lock. Was it truly Liam? Could he have returned in some impossible way? Or was this the work of someone who knew exactly how to terrify me, to push me into panic and uncertainty? The fear was raw, immediate, and consuming. Every logical thought collided with the memories and the longing that surged through me, threatening to break my composure entirely. I managed to steady myself long enough to speak, my voice barely a whisper. Liam, is it really you? There was no immediate response, only a faint shuffling sound, a pause that stretched endlessly. Then, again, the voice, clear, soft, familiar. Mom, please, help me. The words, so simple, carried the weight of memory, of love, and of a bond one had feared lost forever. I felt an ache deep in my chest, a mixture of fear and longing, and for a fleeting moment, I considered opening the door, stepping into the unknown. But instinct, sharpened over months of observing Beatrix and Theo, reminded me to pause. Something was off. The context, the timing, the impossibility of his presence, it all suggested manipulation. I pulled back from the door, trying to regain control, to think clearly. I remembered Liam's phone number, his habits, and the locations he frequented before his passing. A rising suspicion began to form in my mind. This was no ordinary call. The next morning, I spoke with Desmond, a trusted friend who had helped me in matters both personal and practical. Together, we traced the call. Every detail confirmed my growing dread. Liam's phone had indeed pinged near my home in Cedar Hollow during the night. It was impossible, inexplicable, and chilling. The evidence suggested that someone had used his device, or at least its signal, to create the illusion of his presence. And with that realization came a horrifying truth. The source of this terror was not some external stranger but someone inside the family circle. I understood, in that instant, that Beatrix and Theo were capable of manipulating technology, perception, and fear to their advantage. They had studied patterns, learned habits, and found ways to exploit my vulnerabilities. The very children I had raised, the ones I had loved unconditionally, were orchestrating a plot designed to make me doubt reality itself. The depth of their betrayal, the precision of their plan, left me both angry and resolute. The night of the call became a defining moment. It was not only a test of my composure but also a revelation of the lengths to which deception could go. I had been forced to confront fear in its most immediate and personal form. The voice I heard, the figure I saw, the cold that wrapped around me, it was all a carefully constructed illusion, and it proved one truth. The enemy was not a stranger. The enemy was my own children. That night, my fear transformed into vigilance. I realized that every action, every plan, every document signed without scrutiny, had been a part of a larger design. The 2 a.m. call, terrifying as it was, became the moment of clarity. I could no longer be passive, no longer allow myself to be manipulated, and no longer trust appearances alone. The time had come to turn awareness into strategy, to convert fear into preparation, and to observe with the intent to act decisively. In the quiet hours that followed, I reflected on Liam, his foresight, and the intentions he and Arthur had embedded in the family trust. Their protection had prepared me, without my knowledge, for a confrontation that was imminent. I understood, finally, that courage would not be measured by absence of fear, but by the ability to recognize it, control it, and use it to uncover the truth. That night, I resolved to do exactly that, to reclaim control, expose deception, and ensure that justice, memory, and loyalty would prevail. After the terror of that night, I could no longer act as I had before. The 2 a.m. call had shaken me to the core, but it had also sharpened my awareness. Fear, I realized, could be transformed into insight. Every hesitation, every false reassurance, every subtle manipulation by Beatrix and Theo had left traces. And now, it was my turn to observe, to analyze, and to prepare. I would no longer be their victim. I would become the one holding the advantage. I began by reviewing everything I had noticed over the past months. The casual comments, the probing questions, the reduction in visits, the subtle insinuations about my age and decision-making. Patterns emerged, faint but undeniable. Theo had always been interested in technology, quietly learning about systems, monitoring devices, and understanding how to manipulate signals. Beatrix, on the other hand, had cultivated connections with Sterling, a private investigator, someone who had experience digging into personal affairs. Separately, their skills might have seemed harmless. Together, they created a formidable network of surveillance, influence, and intimidation. I reflected on the 2 a.m. call, the fear that had gripped me, and the impossible presence of Liam. It became clear that the children had engineered that moment with precision, using technology, knowledge of habits, and the illusion of his identity to strike terror and doubt into my heart. And yet, for all their preparation, they had overlooked one critical factor: my attention to detail, my memory, and my willingness to think ahead. I began to formulate a plan. It needed to be careful, deliberate, and precise, leaving nothing to chance. I could not confront them directly. They were clever, practiced in concealment and manipulation. Instead, I would observe, record, and gather evidence, allowing their intentions to reveal themselves naturally. I would use their overconfidence against them, setting the stage so that every word, every gesture, and every attempt at deceit would be exposed. Technology became my ally. I installed subtle monitoring devices in key areas, not to spy indiscriminately, but to capture conversations and interactions that might reveal motives. I reviewed financial documents, noting irregularities, patterns, and moments when influence was attempted. Every detail became a piece of the puzzle, a clue to the true character of Beatrix and Theo. I realized that patience would be more powerful than confrontation, and preparation stronger than anger. I also considered the psychological aspect. Beatrix and Theo believed they were in control, that their manipulations were effective. That confidence was a weakness I could exploit. By appearing frail, hesitant, or unsure, I created the illusion that I was still vulnerable, that fear could dictate my actions. In truth, I was building an understanding, assembling evidence, and preparing to guide them into a situation where the truth would no longer be hidden. The more I observed, the more their patterns became clear. Theo's tech skills allowed him to monitor devices and create subtle illusions. Beatrix's influence and connections with Sterling gave her access to information and the ability to manipulate perception. Separately, these talents were impressive. Together, they had nearly succeeded in destabilizing me. But their ambition blinded them to the fact that I was no longer naive. Every attempt to intimidate or deceive had been catalogued, every reaction stored in memory, and every sign of guilt noted. As the days passed, I began to refine the plan. I would wait for the perfect moment, a situation where their actions would expose intent without the ability to deny it. I would orchestrate circumstances so that their overconfidence became a liability, their assumptions a trap. The hidden clause, which they feared and tried to navigate, became a tool in this strategy, a measure of their true loyalty, or lack thereof. Their own actions would be the proof needed to reveal the deception that had haunted my home. I also considered how to leverage external support. Desmond, who had been instrumental in confirming the 2 a.m. call, became an ally in observation and planning. Together, we mapped out the flow of interactions, noting potential triggers, and identifying moments where the children would reveal their motives. The key was subtlety. Any hint that I was aware too soon could derail the plan, allowing them to cover their tracks. Timing, I realized, would be everything. Through it all, my fear transformed into a quiet resolve. The terror that had once paralyzed me became a catalyst for action. I no longer trembled at the memory of Liam's call. Instead, I analyzed it, learned from it, and used it to anticipate the next steps. I had become vigilant, strategic, and prepared to expose deception in its purest form. By the time the plan was complete, I felt a sense of calm determination. Beatrix and Theo believed they were manipulating me, but in reality, they had fallen into the trap of their own ambition. Every step they had taken, every attempt to intimidate, every act of manipulation, would now serve as evidence of intent. And I, having transformed fear into strategy, was ready to confront the truth, to reclaim control, and to ensure that justice would be revealed in full measure. The shift was profound, from fear to foresight, from vulnerability to strategy. I was no longer simply surviving. I was actively preparing for the moment when the full extent of their deception would be exposed, and when the truth, finally, would be undeniable. The day of confrontation arrived, though outwardly it seemed ordinary. Beatrix and Theo arrived at my home, their expressions carefully neutral, the usual veneer of civility masking their intentions. They had no idea that I had anticipated every step, every maneuver, every attempt at deception. Today, the tables would turn, and their confidence would become the very element that betrayed them. I had spent weeks preparing the environment. The garage, a space they associated with casual access and routine storage, had been transformed into a controlled setting. Every camera was positioned to capture audio and visual evidence. A tablet connected to the devices allowed me to observe discreetly from a safe distance. And in the corner, a sealed lockbox contained the recordings that would reveal the truth. Liam's voice, caught on hidden devices over time, and his expressions of concern, carefully documented by Desmond and myself, would speak louder than any argument. I welcomed them with a calm demeanor, the same frailty I had projected for months now fully in place. My voice was soft, measured, as I gestured toward the garage. I thought it might be easier to discuss matters here, I said, masking every trace of anticipation. Beatrix and Theo exchanged brief glances, their confidence apparent. They believed they were still in control. They stepped inside without hesitation, underestimating the careful preparation that surrounded them. Once they were positioned, I guided the conversation with deliberate subtlety. I spoke as though uncertain, hesitant, and overwhelmed by the weight of decisions. I asked questions that seemed ordinary but were designed to provoke explanation and reveal motives. Every response, every word, Every hesitation on their part was now a signal I could interpret. The tension in the garage grew steadily, though they remained unaware that they were being observed and recorded. Then, I drew their attention to the sealed lockbox. "I wanted to show you something," I said quietly, and the air shifted instantly. The subtle shift in their posture betrayed anticipation. They thought the contents were trivial, perhaps an old family document or an inconsequential note. But what they did not know was that the lockbox contained evidence they could not deny. It was a collection of recordings, moments of candid conversation, admissions of intent, and even documentation of the technological manipulations used to create the 2 a.m. call. I placed the tablet in their view, allowing them to see, in real time, the evidence of their actions. Liam's voice, so familiar and clear, played back phrases they had used, confessions they had never imagined would be captured. Every glance, every inflection, every admission of ambition and deceit was laid bare. Their faces fell, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear crossing their features as the truth became undeniable. "Do you see now?" I asked, my voice steady. Every move, every attempt to manipulate, every effort to make me doubt reality, it's all here. Beatrix's composure faltered. Theo's confidence crumbled. They had believed their control was absolute, that the illusion they had crafted would remain unbroken. And yet, in this controlled environment, the reality of their actions spoke louder than their carefully constructed masks. They tried to argue, to minimize, to explain away the evidence, but it was futile. The recordings revealed the truth in a way that words alone never could. Every attempt at deception, every act of manipulation, was now undeniable. Liam's voice, a reminder of both love and vigilance, resonated through the garage, confirming every suspicion, every fear, and every indication of intent. I observed them closely, noting the tension in their shoulders, the rapid shift of their eyes, the subtle tremor of their hands. Each movement was a reflection of guilt and awareness that their schemes had been exposed. They realized, finally, that the control they had sought to wield over me had been turned against them. Every act of manipulation had been catalogued, every subtle test of obedience and fear had been monitored, and now, justice was manifest in undeniable proof. The garage became a theater of revelation. I remained calm, my voice firm yet composed, as the evidence continued to play. Beatrix and Theo could no longer hide behind smiles or rehearsed explanations. Their ambition, their greed, and their disregard for the love and trust they once shared with me were fully revealed. It was a moment of reckoning, both for them and for me. In that room, a transformation occurred. Fear, which had once held me captive, had been transmuted into strategy and clarity. The plan I had cultivated, refined through observation, patience, and careful attention to detail, reached its culmination. Beatrix and Theo's overconfidence, their belief in my continued vulnerability, had led them into a carefully prepared scenario where their true character was exposed. By the time the session concluded, the atmosphere in the garage had changed completely. They were no longer the confident manipulators I had faced for months. They were revealed, exposed, and powerless in the presence of evidence and truth. I had reclaimed authority, demonstrated vigilance, and ensured that deception would no longer dictate outcomes in my life. The 2 a.m. call, the subtle manipulations, the signed documents, they had all been pieces of a larger puzzle that had now been fully resolved. In the quiet aftermath, I felt a mixture of relief and accomplishment. The garage, once an ordinary space, had become a place of revelation, a location where truth prevailed over manipulation, and justice had been enacted with precision. The betrayal that had haunted me for months had been addressed, and the balance of power had shifted decisively. I had transformed fear into action, strategy, and resolution, and in doing so, I had taken the first step toward restoring not only control over my life but also the dignity and security that had been threatened for so long. After the confrontation in the garage, I knew that the next step had to be decisive. It was not enough to expose Beatrix and Theo to their own conscience. I had to ensure that their manipulation could not continue, that their deceit could not harm anyone else, and that justice would be irrevocable. I had prepared for this moment with careful planning, making sure that every conversation, every interaction, and every confession had been recorded securely. The evidence was irrefutable. I contacted a trusted attorney, someone familiar with elder law and the nuances of trusts, and provided the recordings, the signed documents, and the detailed timeline of manipulations. Every interaction, from the 2 a.m. call to the garage confrontation, was documented with precision. The attorney immediately recognized the severity and clarity of the evidence. They assured me that not only could the legal authority over the trust be restored, but the children's malicious intent would also result in disinheritance. Next, I notified the local authorities about the fraudulent attempts to manipulate me using Liam's identity. I explained how technology had been used to create a false sense of fear and confusion. Although it was disturbing to relive the events, the authorities understood the depth of the scheme and its implications. They assured me that, legally, this would further reinforce the case to prevent any claims or challenges by Beatrix and Theo. The realization that law and order were on my side provided a sense of relief I had not felt in months. Then came the moment of execution. Beatrix and Theo were informed that their actions had been recorded and that authorities, along with legal counsel, were reviewing the entirety of their manipulations. I watched their faces as comprehension and fear began to settle in. Their confidence, which had carried them through months of planning and deceit, was gone. The denial, the excuses, and the justifications fell away under the weight of undeniable evidence. Their entitlement had met its match in preparation, vigilance, and justice. With the legal process underway, the family trust was secured according to Arthur's and Liam's original intentions. The hidden clause, which had been the catalyst for their schemes, now became the foundation for their disinheritance. Their failure to provide genuine care and support was irrefutable, leaving no room for claim or argument. I watched as the legal documents were adjusted, sealing their status and ensuring that the legacy they had sought to manipulate was preserved for its rightful purposes. In addition to reclaiming control of the trust, I also made arrangements to secure Liam's private investments, which had grown significantly over the years. With careful management, these funds provided not only for my own comfort and security, but also for the establishment of a small foundation aimed at protecting elders from manipulation, abuse, and deceit. I had transformed a situation of fear and betrayal into a legacy of empowerment, ensuring that others could learn from my experience. The finality of this process brought an unexpected calm. The fear that had once gripped me during the 2 a.m. call, the tension that had dominated the household for months, and the anger that had surged during the garage confrontation, all of it transformed into clarity and strength. Beatrix and Theo could no longer exert influence, no longer manipulate perception, and no longer threaten my security or peace of mind. The consequences of their choices were absolute and undeniable. I reflected on the months of preparation, observation, and patience that had brought me to this point. Every step, from noticing patterns to turning fear into strategy, had been essential. I realized that justice does not always arrive immediately, and it does not always take the form of punishment alone. Sometimes, justice is the careful, deliberate protection of one's own dignity, safety, and legacy. Through vigilance and decisive action, I had ensured that the truth prevailed and that the consequences of deception were clear. Finally, I took a moment to consider the lessons learned. Fear can be transformed into insight, manipulation can be countered with patience and observation, and betrayal, though painful, can reveal the true character of those closest to us. I knew that my actions had not only restored security for myself but had also prevented future harm, safeguarding not only my legacy but the well-being of others who might face similar threats. As I concluded the legal proceedings and confirmed the foundation's establishment, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The house was once again mine, the environment safe, and the shadow of deceit lifted. Beatrix and Theo had been exposed, disinherited, and prevented from causing further harm. Liam's memory and Arthur's foresight had guided me, and the lessons of vigilance, patience, and courage had proven essential. I turned to the camera, my voice calm but firm. If this could happen in Cedar Hollow, it could happen anywhere. Subscribe so you're never blindsided. The words were simple, yet the weight of experience behind them made the message undeniable. Justice had been achieved, but awareness, vigilance, and action were what ensured it remained unbroken. As I sit here, reflecting on everything that has passed, I feel a quiet sense of clarity. The months of fear, uncertainty, and betrayal were intense, and yet they revealed truths that I could not have discovered otherwise. Beatrix and Theo showed me the lengths some people will go for greed, control, or selfish ambition. They reminded me that even the ones we love most can sometimes make choices that hurt us deeply. But I also discovered resilience, awareness, and the strength that comes from refusing to be silenced, manipulated, or intimidated. Liam's memory, the guidance of Arthur, and the careful preparation I took allowed me to turn fear into action. That 2 a.m. call, which seemed impossible, became a catalyst for vigilance. The experience taught me that courage does not mean absence of fear. It means moving forward despite it, analyzing it, and using it to prepare and protect oneself. And it is that lesson I want to share with anyone watching this story. Awareness and action can transform even the most frightening situations into opportunities for justice. I want you to understand that betrayal is not always dramatic. Often, it is subtle. It hides in casual comments, small manipulations, and quiet tests of patience or trust. It can wear many masks: sweetness, care, concern. But beneath it, there may be motives that harm instead of help. Being aware of these patterns, observing carefully, and trusting one's instincts are essential steps in protecting yourself and your legacy. The deception I faced could have crushed me if I had allowed panic, fear, or confusion to dominate my decisions. Yet, through patience, strategy, and a willingness to act decisively, I reclaimed control. I exposed manipulation, ensured justice, and protected not only myself but also the legacy Liam and Arthur had carefully safeguarded. What seemed impossible, the 2 a.m. call, the use of Liam's identity, the careful orchestration of deceit, was not the end. It was the beginning of understanding, preparation, and ultimately, empowerment. Each step I took after that night, each careful observation, each piece of evidence I gathered, led to a resolution that could not be ignored or undone. I hope that my story serves as both a warning and an inspiration. To those who feel vulnerable, who worry about deceit within their families, or who fear manipulation, know this: awareness and vigilance are your most powerful tools. Protect your dignity, document interactions, and never underestimate your ability to respond with clarity and strategy. Justice is possible, even when the odds feel insurmountable, and even when fear seems overwhelming. Now, I feel a profound sense of peace. The house is secure, the foundation is established, and the memory of Liam guides every decision I make. There is healing in knowing that betrayal cannot define the end of a story if it is met with wisdom, courage, and action. Beatrix and Theo have faced the consequences of their choices, and the legacy they sought to manipulate is preserved for purposes that honor care, love, and responsibility. I also want to remind everyone watching that protecting oneself is not selfish. It is necessary. Caring for family does not mean surrendering your voice, your security, or your well-being. Boundaries, observation, and decisive action are acts of strength, and they honor not only yourself but those who come after you. If you ever face manipulation, deceit, or fear, remember that awareness is the first step, strategy is the second, and courage is the final bridge to reclaiming control. Finally, I want to speak directly to you, watching this story unfold. Your experiences, your fears, your thoughts, they matter. I invite you to share them with me. If you haven't subscribed yet, tell me why in the comments. I am listening, and your perspective is important. And if my story has resonated, if it has inspired you to reflect on your own life, your family, or your boundaries, please like the video and engage. Your engagement ensures that these lessons, this awareness, and this story of resilience continue to reach those who may need it most. Through every moment of fear, uncertainty, and betrayal, one truth became clear. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Awareness and preparation can transform even the darkest moments into opportunities for justice, protection, and empowerment. And above all, love, memory, and foresight guide us to make choices that preserve dignity, honor legacy, and ensure that truth cannot be silenced.